Okay, welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Standards Committee, which is being broadcast live. Can I just remind people of normal housekeeping arrangements, such as switching off mobile phones to silent, and there will be no fire test planned for the meeting. So if there is an emergency evacuation, please go to the assembly point, which is Tudor Square. And again, reminder, and I think we're all experienced at this, to use the microphone, as that enables the broadcast to be sufficiently there. Quick introduction to everybody in the room, so that the members of the public know who we are. I'm Councillor Colin Ross, I'm chair of today's meeting, and can I ask, including officers who are in the room as well, so we'll go around clockwise. Jill.
Thank you, Chair. Gillian Duckworth, Director of Legal and Governance.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Councillor Tom Hunt.
Hello everyone, I'm Councillor Kevin Oxley.
Councillor Simon Clement-Jones.
Stephen Bathroom, Internal Audit Finance Manager.
Councillor Angela Argento.
Jane Wilby, Head of Accounting.
I'm Ryan Keyworth, Director of Finance and Commercial Services.
Chair Bell, Democratic Services Officer.
Okay, thank you very much. Have we had any apologies for absence?
We received the one apology from the independent co-opted member, Alison Howard.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll record that. Item 3 is exclusion of the press and public, and there are no items on the agenda today that, where we have to exclude the press and public. Item 4, declarations of interest. Do any members have any declarations to make about any items on today's agenda? No? Okay, thank you. Minutes of the previous meeting, which was the 16th of June this year. Can we agree those as a true record? I'm getting nods of assent, so agreed? Agreed. And are there any matters arising from those minutes? Yes, go ahead.
Just a couple. On page 11, 6.9, the Senior Finance Manager, Internal Audit, agreed to check that the safeguarding lead, whether the person in position of trust training was requested to be mandated, and if not, why. Have we found that out? And the other one is on page 13 regarding the new management system for housing, whether actually the contract was signed off in June, because they weren't allowed to tell us who that we were going for because it was still live.
Thank you for those. Can any officers help us out with either of those?
I don't have answers for you, but we can get the answers and feedback to the committee.
Yeah, can you circulate to all members of the committee? Thank you. Okay, that brings us to the first substantive item on the agenda, the summary of statement of accounts for the previous financial year. Ryan, I think you're going to introduce this one.
Thanks very much, Chair. So this report presents the unaudited set of financial statements that, in my capacity as Chief Finance Officer, I've signed off. This is essentially the start of the audit process. What I can guarantee you is the set of accounts that are linked to in this document here will change as the audit process goes on. That is inevitable. So what we've got here is a summary of the basis on which the accounts are prepared and the timetable that we expect to see the accounts go through to ultimate sign-off, which, if everything goes to plan, is before the end of this calendar year. So, like I said, local authorities are required to submit their accounts for audit before the 31st of July, so here we are today to commence that process. There is then something called the accounts inspection period, which starts now and runs for a period of 6 weeks, where members of the public, citizens of Sheffield, are entitled to inspect the accounts. It's quite an old concept, I'm sure you'll understand, where members of the public are allowed to essentially ask questions about the statement of account and about the detailed financial records that underpin them. That ability goes quite a long way, actually, in terms of what members of the public are entitled to ask. We expect the audit process to commence early in the autumn. We're currently talking to our external auditors, Ernst & Young, about the timetable for that. That should finish, like I said, towards the end of November with a following wind. I know last year it dragged on quite considerably. We are very keen, as are the external auditors, that is not repeated, that we do actually finish them. And then we'll be back later this year, hopefully, to seek sign-off from the committee for both the final set of financial statements and also for the external auditors to present their report. Just a few words on local authority accounting. This stuff is horribly complicated. It's like no other sector, to be brutally honest. I've worked in the private sector and I've worked in the university sector, so charity. The accounts we have are pretty difficult to penetrate. What Claire's done, Claire Sharrett, who prepared this report, has pulled out some of the key transactional differences between a comprehensive income and expenditure statement and the more familiar way in which local authorities, councils report their financial performance. Councils are a bit odd when it comes to our financial statements. Cash flow is a really important statement for most organisations. Cash flow, cash balance is a really important thing, certainly for private sector firms and for universities. It's less of an issue for local authorities due to the way we're funded and financed. So what these accounts are fundamentally a very, very comprehensive financial compliance document. If the auditors say they're happy with them, you can take significant assurance that our financial processes and procedures are doing what they should, and that the numbers we report elsewhere in formats that are perhaps more familiar are backed by robust controls that have been subject to some fairly rigorous tests. Accounting standards over the last 25 years, in my working memory, have really changed the way accounts are presented. And again, the reasons they've done the reasons for the changes are incredibly important, very valid, but they make it more difficult to read a set of local authority accounts. Back when I started out, a long time ago in the 90s, accounts were characterised by a relatively tidy, very easy to understand profit and loss account that a finance director could frankly manage. There were no surprises in a profit and loss account in the private sector back in the 90s. All the mess that caused that, or that allowed that, was held on the balance sheet, made balance sheets really complicated, really difficult. Then Enron happened, then Lehman Brothers happened, then the financial collapse of the late noughties happened. Accounting standards developed very quickly to address those issues and to make compliance with basic control principles much more to the fore. That resulted in a very tidy balance sheet. So if you're a private sector company, you produce a pretty tidy balance sheet and the market can assess that. And all the mess that causes that goes through the comprehensive income and expenditure statement, as we call it, profit and loss account. So that, in local authority terms, means that movements on pension valuations hit the front of the income and expenditure statement, which make it swing wildly. 200 odd million pounds, I think it is on this one. That can be up and down depending on movements in the market, the status of the actuarial valuation and all that sort of stuff. Back in the old days, the movement on the pension deficit used to move in reserves on the balance sheet. You never saw it on the front of the I&E account, so it kept it tidy. The mess was in the balance sheet. This changes it. So it does make it quite difficult to read. We acknowledge that. When I last sat in front of an audit committee at this council in 2009 and presented a set of accounts, it was 100 pages long. It's now 175. The extent of the disclosures that are now going on if the auditors say they're good, I don't expect necessarily members of the committee to read and understand them. it can and should give you a lot of assurance that the controls we've got in place and that the accounting that we're doing are robust. So, having said all that, I'll pick out one or two things. On paragraph 11, page large numbers 21, there is a table that tries to explain how you get from the Council's outturn report, which I presented to the Strategy and Resources Committee a few weeks ago, where we reported an overspend of just under £20 million, to a surplus on income and expenditure of £361 million. There are some enormous swings in that, and these are the accounting entries that are necessary to reflect changes largely in valuations or adjustments to the way we account for pension funds. And you can see that pension is the word there that's associated with the biggest number movements. So that's what we have here. It's essentially a set of control documents that should give you comfort, and that's what they do for me, frankly. They give me comfort that we've got our systems and processes in order and that we are compliant with the relevant accounting standards. I just wonder if there's anything else from here that I particularly want to pull out and highlight. I don't think there is, Chair. I'm happy to try and take any questions on this. Conscious that A, they're unaudited, and B, the person who prepared these accounts is unfortunately at very short notice unable to be with us today. So there might be quite a few examples of, we'll get back to you with an answer to that, Councillor. If I can apologise for that answer in advance, Chair, but I'll try and take any questions that members do have.
Okay, open to members for questions. Kevin, and then Angela.
Hi, Ryan. I too am used to university accounts, so I appreciate your pain. I just wondered, in terms of such as cash flow in the university system, we have to have so many days of cash flow to be confident to have enough money to pay whatever wages, bills and so forth. So are we in the similar situation within the council? And also from our reserves point of view, obviously, there's no information on there in terms of what the size of our reserves are, but is there a level of reserve that as a council we must hold to be confident?
That I can help you with. The way that private sector companies and universities, very similar actually, manage cash is fundamentally different to the way we do it here. Companies and universities don't go bust because of a reported I&E income and expenditure position. They go bust because they run out of cash. And the thing that exercises every university finance director is whether they've got enough cash in the bank to see them to the next student loan company payment or whatever it happens to be. So as a university, you'd be looking to make sure you'd probably got 6 months worth of cash at short notice call, either in the bank or on a revolving credit facility or something like that. The way we are funded and the timing of the money that we get from our various government grants and funders tends to mean we're very cash positive and we're funded ahead of time. So we're not in the same situation. In fact, a challenge we have is what to do with the cash that we get up front before we need to spend it. That comes in the form of the Treasury Management Policy and Strategy and an outturn report that I brought to Strategy and Resources on the 5th of July, which speaks a lot to the counterparty limits. In other words, how we assure ourselves that we're placing money with financial institutions of a significant creditworthiness. Back to some of the lessons learned about 15 years ago, we didn't have any money in Iceland at Sheffield City Council. That was by a combination of luck and judgment at the time, but there was a fair bit of luck in that. So cash flow is different for councils. We don't worry about that as in the same way that universities or other organisations do. We fund the capital programme through a combination of borrowing, but also cash. So we don't borrow for all the capital expenditure that we incur. We do use some cash. You know, we record depreciation charges in these accounts. They're written differently because it's a council, but depreciation charges to these accounts has the same effects as it does in any organisation, really. If you report a surplus at the bottom after depreciation, there's cash left over that you can then reinvest in capital investment. We do that on a broader scale. A lot of the capital we've invested in that way this year has been in Heart of the City rather than our own facilities. It's for regeneration and other purposes. So we really do divorce where the money comes from, in many cases, from the capital expenditure itself. So we don't worry about that too much. Reserves, yeah, we spend quite a lot of time looking at the reserves. Actually, in the detail of the accounts, it is there, but you can't really see it. Again, we report that more clearly in the budget report, actually, that comes to Council each March. As at the 31st of March, just gone, we had something like £300 million of reserves, which breaks down into a general fund balance, which is effectively the free available reserves for emergencies, about 13 million, 12.9 million pounds. As a percentage of our net income, that's a low number, but there's a chunk of the 300 million that's also actually available. And again, the budget report sets that out in more detail. We made a judgment as part of that budget that £70 million was available to support the council's financial recovery, because we are reporting a deficit on that revenue basis. 20 of it was used last year to balance the books. 15 was used to set the budget for this year, and then that gives us then 35 left to manage timing and delivery risks for this year's budget, and a little bit of contingency in case we need it going forward. So that's where we're at. It is quite a different financial management. You know, when I stopped working at university and started working here, you have to kind of unload a cassette and put a new one in, if you like, to reset your accounting mind.
Angela.
Yes, thank you. I think without, being too complicated, because it's difficult to get your head around it if you're a lay person, but from the page that you were looking at, page 21, it looks like that we have a surplus, but that is actually mostly because of the revaluation of the pension. Could you just explain in very simple terms for people out there what that means? Because that also impacts on the cash flow, because the cash flow as a local authority is actually not that relevant, because there are all these kind of accounting tricks. Not tricks, but you know what I mean, that make it look different, so it's not as simple as a cash flow for anybody. Could you just explain to people out there, just very simply, why there was a revaluation of the pension and why so wildly different that, it's like over 200 million different to what it was the previous year? Thank you.
Okay, so just very briefly on the cash flow. The cash flow statement itself is a really critical compliance statement because it explains the movement in cash balances from one year to the next. So whilst most finance directors in other types of organisations really, really worry about how much cash they've got in the bank, and I worry about it less than they do. I still worry about it, but I worry about it less than they do. The cash flow statement in the accounts is a critical control document. It's actually really difficult to get to work, actually. The team spend an enormous amount of time getting it to balance, and the auditors spend quite a lot of time looking at it. Okay, pensions. The pension numbers that we're talking about are huge. We have a significant pension asset, so they're the investments that back the pension promises that have been made previously, and we have a significant pension liability. That's the value of the payments that need to be made in the future to people who have already retired or are still working or have stopped working for the council and are working somewhere else but haven't yet retired yet. It doesn't take much of a movement in the value of those investments, and 2021-22 is a good example of a year where the value of investments moved quite a bit during the year as we emerged from the height of the pandemic, and towards the end of the year the effect of the war in Ukraine started to be felt. Well, they'd already been properly felt in financial markets, so big movements in the way that investments are valued. The pension fund manager, South Yorkshire Pensions, has been doing, frankly, a very good job over the last few years in managing the risks to those pension investments, those assets. And as a result, the scheme has moved from a deficit position where the value of the assets was less than the value of the expected future pension payments to a situation where the value of the assets exceeds the expected future pension payments, so that we've gone from a deficit position to a surplus position. Those of you with university knowledge will be unfamiliar with the concept of a surplus position on a pension fund. And as was I at the council last time I was here, it was always in deficit. The council was always making a cash contribution to the pension fund to pay the deficit down, as well as making contributions for current service. We no longer make a deficit contribution because there is no deficit to contribute to. So the value of investment assets causes the asset number to go up and down. The liability number goes up and down depending on the people who are still entitled to benefits in the scheme, either now or in the future. It's affected by assumptions on longevity and illness and a raft of other things like that. So there are loads of actuarial assumptions that cover that. The actuary makes a formal reassessment of the valuation of the scheme every 3 years. That's just been undertaken. That's not reflected, I don't think, in these accounts. But each year they provide an update, and it's that update that is reflected in these accounts. And the combination of those two things is what's caused a 300, well, the lion's share of a £300 million movement there. But it doesn't take a significant percentage shift in those enormous numbers to cause a movement like that, I'm afraid. We've got a lot of people who've worked for us and work for us, and the value of those pensions stretch out for many, many years to come.
Okay, thank you. Tom.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Ryan, for the presentation. It's really, really useful, and especially that last answer. As a member of the University Pension Scheme and as a member of UCU, I've learnt quite a bit about university pension scheme deficits over the last few years, but we won't go on to my personal pain. I wanted to ask a question about the audit process. On page 20, in paragraph 5, it says that the process for the timings could be held up by members objecting to the accounts. Totally understand that. But it then says, in addition, it's expected that the external audit process will run into December 22, so that we won't meet the 30th of November 22 statutory deadline. Could you just shed a bit of light into sort of why that is? And then the other question was, and this may be one that you need to come back on, I don't know, on the housing revenue account, the expenditure in 2020-21 was considerably lower than 21-22. Obviously, a lot of that will be to do with the pandemic and extraordinary circumstances, but I just wondered if you could give me any insight into whether the expenditure in 21-22 is comparable to previous years. Are we sort of, is that a more standard measure that we should be looking at for future years? Thank you.
I will get you an answer on that last one, because I think a time series would help, together with an explanation of the consequences of the pandemic, rather than trying to remember exactly the detail of that. The audit process. It's interesting. Well, it is if you do my job. There was a public accounts committee, I think it was, or it might have been a local government housing committee, select committee meeting not that long ago, where senior civil servants frankly got a bit of a grilling about the audit timescales for local government accounts. Permanent Secretary, Director General and Director of Local Government Finance were in front of the committee for that one. There's genuinely quite a lot of difficulty in the local government audit market at the moment. Getting people who want to do local government audit is tricky. They're horribly technical accounts. They don't read easily across to others. They don't even particularly read that easily across to even the NHS. So you need people who really want to get into local authority auditing and spend a bit of time and effort on it. Audit firms are having difficulty recruiting people to do those jobs, and when they train and they do them, they go off to do something that they consider to be more interesting, or frankly something that pays more. So the audit firms generally across the country are having a challenge to do this. Ernst & Young are a massive international audit firm. They're having difficulty like everybody else. So some of the timing that we talk to them about is how to make sure that we get a good team who know what they're doing, who've been here before on the job, because otherwise we're going to spend weeks or months training them on almost, mean, I've sat down with auditors before and explained to them how our accounts work, which always doesn't feel like the right way round. Because they're new to the job or whatever, and if you're trying to rush it through and hit a particular deadline that is important, but I'd rather get a good audit than hit 30 November. That's the challenge they face. So that's the job we've got to do, to work with our external auditors to get a good team who know the organisation well, and I think we've got that. I met with them earlier this week, probably yesterday, just to talk through the plans that they've got and to make sure that they've got the right team in place, and I think they have. But it does mean that we'll be running towards the end of the deadline. There are councils in this country whose accounts for last year are yet to be signed off, and it's not a small percentage. In part because of audit challenges, some of it because of accounting issues that they've got, and that's their issue. But a good number are because of challenges in getting audits completed and signed off. So I think we're relatively well placed. There's a very good chance we won't hit 30 November. I don't think there'll be any consequences on us for that. There haven't been so far. I think it's just important that we get this done as quickly as possible. The major reason for me, as much as anything else actually, is to give the team a break between finishing one audit and starting another set of accounts. And last year they didn't have one, and it makes it very difficult for them to do that. But I think we'll be all right. I'm really bothered about getting a good quality audit though. That's what I'm after.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any further questions? Okay, thank you. The recommendation is we're asked to note the core statements and keynotes for the unaudited statement accounts for 21-22, which is agreed, and we look forward to updates and then the final version, hopefully not very far after the 30th of November, but I take on board your comments about quality is better than rushing it through. Okay, thank you. So we now move to item 7 on the agenda, Internal Audit Annual Fraud Report. And Stephen, this is your specialist subject, I think.
One of many, I think, Chair. Although this might seem a weighty tome, and I hope you've not dropped it on your foot the last couple of days, the key thing is the report at the beginning. The purpose is to show you what we did last year and what we're intending to do this year in terms of fraud. Members are asked to note the contents of that report, the policies which underlie our processes, and also to note the checklist which I've prepared, which shows us sort of key questions we think you might want to ask to show that we've got the governance arrangements in place. I'm not intending to go through this in massive detail, or the policies. A lot of the policies haven't changed dramatically from what we had before. We do an annual review on them, but we've done a bit more of a review on them this time, and we've updated one or two things which I will talk through. I think talk through some of the main elements in there. We do quite a bit of fraud investigation ourselves as we go along, but we're also a small team, so we do quite a bit with management in individual investigations that they're undertaking. Some of the more minor frauds and fraud areas that come up might be to do with things like timesheet frauds, which are part of some other investigation, so we'll support them in that. However, the more difficult ones we will deal with. The national picture is the amount of fraud in the public sector has gone up in the last couple of years. One of the key areas for that is that the amount of COVID grants that were given out by central government and the fraud which attacked that, and I can talk through where that affects the council, but we're in a lot better position than anything in that area. It's a significant impact across the economy, and one of the main things we aim to do as a council is to try and prevent fraud rather than deal with the aftermath of it. So we try and get a strong governance arrangement in place and strong controls which hopefully are a deterrent to people coming in. And we have a number of policies in place which that suite of policies underpins it, so that people can go to the most relevant documents in there, and it will help them through the process for preventing fraud in the first place, understanding what the risks are, and then moving forward from that. To help that, the Finance Department's recently introduced two groups. One's the Finance Design Authority, which in essence primarily looks at new systems that are coming in to make sure they've got robust controls in there. And also, when Jane sits on the Standards and Policies group, which looks at the key policies that the council have for financial and other arrangements, and how they can be made better from a fraud point of view. We have members sit on both of those two groups, so anything that's new that's coming through, we can do that first, so it prevents problems in things like auditing later on, where we're going in, the phrase normally is, what does an auditor do? Bayonets the wounded. So we ought to get in there in advance and get the controls into the systems before we start. So the work that we've done last year, we were involved in 10 reactive investigations. It's on paragraph 21, and a further 16 where we were supporting managers in there. We've concluded a number of investigations which were left over from the previous year. Due to COVID, we couldn't deal with some of them because we couldn't get to interview people, etc. And we've dealt with those. The outcome is we've had no major frauds which we've had to report to the police. We have been in discussion with the police on one or two issues, but none of them came out as fraud. A lot of the issues we have are low level, which are disciplinary matters, and we have had a number of individuals as a result of that who've left the authority for various reasons, and probably wouldn't want to re-employ either. One area that continues to concern us is parking machines, and I've raised this. Hopefully we've got some of the individuals looking in tonight who are involved in this, but we have parking machines which are broken into. They're electronically controlled, so we have a team that go out and empty the parking machines on a regular basis. So the amount of money we keep in there is minimal, and the amount of losses that we have from that is also minimal. However, the cost of those machines is about £4,500. So the fact that they might get away with, £20, after a lot of effort in doing it, is actually costing us £4,500 in replacing the machines. We've had discussions with the police, but they tend to pick on the ones which are never have security cameras looking at them, so they get away with it. But my hope tonight, if we get nothing else, is to say to the criminals, you go into a lot of effort for very little. Please go and do something else. We also tend to be attacked by criminal gangs. The main one they use is phishing exercises, particularly for, I don't know if you're aware, bank mandate fraud. But basically, they try and get in and circumvent all our controls by attacking and changing somebody's bank account details. So we've got a legitimate payment that goes to the wrong individual. And that's an ongoing area. But we do have robust controls in there, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. We've also been involved in the last year in a number of other investigations where we've been dealing with separate organisations such as banks, DWP, Hmrc, and in a few cases, the Insolvency Service, where they're doing big national investigations, and we're providing information to do with those. Other work across the council involving fraud. Blue badges, that's where the parking team go out there. They have issued fines in the past year for contraventions of blue badges, but they've not done any prosecutions. The main reason being they can't get the prosecutions into court. However, That has now changed, and they are looking at some prosecutions in that area. We also have an housing and tenancy team who will look at right to buy. There's 2 qualified investigators in there, and they've recovered 23 properties in the last year, which, if you think about it, a council house is roughly about £180,000 worth of cost in there. Most of those are people who, when we've started the investigations, suddenly decide to unback the tenancies. We have had one significant one that's got to court, and that concluded in £5,000 fine from plus costs and 150 hours community service, and that's for a subletting. These are sometimes difficult to deal with and come across. However, that team is very good and persistent, and they've got a number of cases which are about to go to court. Bank mandate fraud, which I've already mentioned. Just to mention that the attacks are frequent, we're used to it, so we've got strong controls in place to address it, and it is an area that internal audit, as part of their normal work, are doing this year, just to make sure those controls are in place. The whistleblowing policy is being updated currently and will be republished shortly. Just to let you know, on money laundering, Jane is the council's money laundering reporting officer now, taking over from Dave. In the last year, I've reported 4 incidents of potential money laundering through to the National Crime Agency, and they've had no issues with those. They've not come back to us to tell us not to proceed. They've allowed those transactions to go through. But it's better to be preventing. Counter-fraud plan for next year. We've got 4 pieces of work in there, one of which is with you tonight, which is the anti-fraud policies. We'll be reviewing councillors' declarations of interest, and also the processes for council tax exemptions and small business grant relief. This is not where we've got frauds, but there are areas where there's potential for fraud, so we'll cover those in more detail from a fraud angle, and they come out of the fraud budget. We've also got fraud e-learning module, which is available to all officers and councillors. That, so far, we've had 1,046 as at the beginning of this month, officers who've completed it, and it's now compulsory for all managers in the organisation to undertake that. The system's playing up. I've highlighted in the report what that e-learning covers. Just to say that in terms of resources, we've got 3 qualified fraud investigators, so we're fraud specialists, as well as being auditors and accountants as well. We're spending 204 days, which is about 14% of the audit plan this year, on fraud, and that covers mainly 4 areas. Fraud investigations, which we will undertake, 4 pieces of proactive work, supporting managers in their work, the work on NFI, and also the housing benefits system review work. NFI, do members know what the National Fraud Initiative is? I presume you've all come across in its various guises. But basically, we have to provide a number of data sets to the government, which they will then match and send us any matches back that they think we need to look at. It's a 2-year cycle, so the last year we've been doing the exercise of looking at the matches. The current year, going forward, is the submission year. The last lot of matches we had back was in January 2021, and we had 10,000 matches came back to us, and we evaluated 4,800 of them. If we're not finding any matches, we'll stop in a particular area, but we did do all 890 high priority matches, and I think we've got about 10 outstanding at the moment. These are the more difficult ones to do with inter-council work that needs to be done, but most of them have now been done. We also had another 9,000, we had 9,000 COVID grant payments made, and we had 146 matches back on that to look at. They've been looked at and dealt with appropriately. And the level of fraud, or not fraud, but the level of error in those is pretty minimal in terms of the amount of money that we've paid out. So we're not in any sort of situation like the central government ones are. We've also updated 700 records. This is mainly in blue badges where people have died and not informed us. So that prevents any more issues in there. Of the 135 errors or minor fraud that we came across as that, we had £164,000 in total that we identified, and 86,000 of that has been or will be recovered. The only exception to where we don't recover is we make pension gratuities to some ex-members of staff, and if they've died and they've been overpaid, we don't recover that money. The numbers and the values are fairly low in total. That's been a policy for a number of years. So the basic matches where we found money, one was around council tax support payments, where we found 27 errors in there, £42,000. That's been recovered. We had a few duplicate payments in creditors, a total value of £32,000. Yet again, that's been recovered due to some errors in the system. But that's minor in terms of what we do, but we pick that up. There's a pension gratuities, which I mentioned, totaling £77,000 and 97 cases. It was higher than it would normally be, but that could just be down to timing differences. Perhaps, sadly, the number of our pensioners who've died recently. This year, it's a submission year, so there's 3 areas we're going to cover. One is the privacy notices, which go out to tell people what we're going to do with their data. One is the submission of the data, and then there'll be the initial matches coming back where we have to train the staff up across the organisation on how to use the systems and what checks are required. Appendix A is the checklist for you to look at, where we've identified areas of potential fraud risk, etc. And we've provided the assurance on there on what we've done about that. One of the key, and then there's the policies, and I sort of just highlight some of the more significant ones. The money laundering policy's changed because the legislation has changed. It doesn't alter our processes in there, but it does alter the legislation that we're coming under. I've already mentioned the Financial Design Authority in the policies group, so we're trying to, we've incorporated that into the policies. The other documents have been done and uprated. One of the things is knowing your client, where the Hmrc sanctions list has also increased. Last time, 2 years ago, we had about 3,000 companies and individuals on that sanctions list. As of yesterday, there were 47,000 on there. So that means in areas where we're dealing with foreign nationals or companies, there's more in there to check. Not that we found any, and we did a trawl across our systems recently and didn't come up with anything in that area. The rest of it is just the policies. So that we have an anti-fraud and corruption policy, which is the overarching document. We have one which helps people identify the fraud risks in an area. We obviously have we have a fraud response plan, which helps where those risks are identified to ensure we get adequate controls in there. We've also got the money laundering policy or anti-money laundering policy in there, and a bribery and corruption policy. One of the main things under the legislation is if we have a policy in place, it helps in any defence of any claims. If you haven't got a policy in place, it's difficult to defend yourself if you have a claim in there. And then we have a document which, knowing your customer, and we have a more succinct version for schools because their risk portfolio in terms of fraud tends to be smaller. So we have a document which we publish and allows schools to look at their risks on their own merits and deal with those. So if anybody's got any questions.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got hands up. I'll take Angela, Simon, and then Kevin.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you very much for that. It's funny that you looked at me when you said bank mandate. I think I asked a question of you about a couple of years ago about that. I just have a few questions. It's more observation on the first bit on the checklist. And I think I've said this before. If we have a yes or no answer, you know, where there are areas where we might think we have very good governance in place, but actually things are still happening because it's inevitable. Should it actually be a yes or no answer? It's just one of those philosophical questions. But on point 5, because we're now in a committee system which is acknowledged in the actions, it says, does a councillor have a portfolio responsibility for fighting fraud? Because now we're in a committee system, should it still say a councillor rather than, should we change the wording there? I'm not just asking the question, I'm not saying that's correct. And I don't know, maybe Jill will be able to enlighten us on that. It might just be that that's the only way we can word it. And the point I was making was on page 62, do we have effective arrangement for reporting fraud and recording fraud? And we have 2 yeses, but then it says in the action, it says, although the above controls are in place, full compliance cannot be assured. So, you know, I'm just questioning the yes and no thing, which I've done before, actually, when we read this report. And then there was something further. I'll have to find it. Do you want to answer that? And then I'll see if I can find the other bit.
Just before you answer that, Angela, what was the page reference for the, you asked Jill about reference to councillor?
Page 59.
Thank you. Stephen, over to you.
The reason why the word councillor is used in there is because this is taken from originally from a SITFA document, and they talk about having a single councillor being responsible for fraud across the organisation. So that's why it's not a committee, because it's more difficult than that. I think more or less a lot of it relates to this committee, because you've got the oversight of the counter fraud arrangements in there. And the other question you asked around the yes or no, we did once try to do it as a percentage, but it's very difficult. So it's much easier to say yes we do or no we don't, and we need to do something about it. So that's the sort of simple answer to that one.
I've remembered what the other thing was. Whilst I was reading all of this, I was thinking, do I actually, me myself, as a councillor, know how to report fraud or suspected kind of bribery or whatever? Because I know we have to follow the code of conduct, but if I were to suspect that there is fraud in any part of the council with all the work I do, or I'm not sure I actually know where to find how to do that, would it be possible to share the procedure or who to go to? I mean, I would go to Gillian, I suppose, but if there is a procedure to follow, it would be good to share it with us.
Funnily enough, when I sent all these documents out, there's an extra one which Jay came back to me and said, do you want that one included? Which is a one-pager, which is for reporting fraud. So it highlights the difference between reporting frauds internally and the thing that we don't do as a council, and we haven't done for about the last 7 years, is the housing benefit fraud, which is dealt with by the DWP. So it's just a one-pager which we will be putting up onto the website shortly. Now we've agreed all these, just to remind people of how to do it. We have a fraud reporting hotline which rings on this computer and the colleagues. So yeah, and then anything that comes through, we're only happy to deal with it, whether that's by email, we've got a dedicated fraud line, or if you want to do, which occasionally happens, is somebody will send us a letter in. The more detail, the better.
So just to, if we suspect some fraud somewhere as members, should we go, is it Gillian we go to, or Gillian's replacement in future? Is that the question? And then just in answer to your question about the council responsible, I suddenly realise it's probably me then, is it, for fraud? That didn't come out right. Council responsible for fraud is me, no. Yeah, but you know what I mean, yeah, okay.
With regard to reporting it, there'll be a process that Stephen is referring to, but you can always just contact myself, Chief Executive, Ryan, Stephen directly if there's anything and you're unsure about how to deal with it, just get in touch. So we can do that, but I'm sure Stephen will provide you with the formal process for that. Jane, sorry, I missed Jane out there, and she's the the reporting officer. Second question was about councillor responsibility. I think Stephen's mentioned that this question is pulled from a standard question for SITFA. So does a council have portfolio responsibility for fighting fraud across the council? I think his answer there about Strategy and Resources Committee is correct, and explains that actually in a committee system no single councillor has responsibility for anything. So Angela's point was right, and our answer wouldn't be a single councillor, it would be a committee. I suspect that that's not always obvious to organisations such as SITFA. There is an expectation that single councillors will have some decision-making power because the majority of councils in the country do.
Sorry, Chair, can I come back on that? So should it be say no in answer to the question on top of page 59? Because it says, is there a single councillor that is responsible for fraud? And it says yes. That's why I asked the question. And then it says that the committee is actually responsible. That's why I asked, should we change the wording, or the answer is incorrect.
Sorry, yeah, it is slightly contradictory. If the tick goes in the no box, then the answer works.
We'll have a look at that for next year, but otherwise we'll hold Colin responsible for it all.
Or the Chair of Strategy and Resources, I've just read it there. Okay, I've got Simon, Kevin, then Tom.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, a couple of things. If I can get a paragraph 41. Well, it kind of starts there. Just in terms of the registering of business interests and directorships, is that only councillors or is that employees as well? And obviously from that, you've then decided this year to do proactive work around the reviewing councillors' declarations of interest. And I'm wondering if, what risk you identified that is informing doing that, and perhaps a little bit around what exactly that means, if that's kind of proactively probing people's interests and their directorships, or if it's again a similar kind of matching exercise as to last time. And I do have another question after that, if I may, Chair.
Yes, the piece of work that we looked at last year was part of the NFI, so we get the matches back, and we specifically went through the ones which are payroll to payroll and the declarations of interest. So that was two pieces of work we did. So we looked at that and went through it. We didn't find anything that was of significant. However, we know that the arrangements for councillors have changed as part of the committee structure, etc. And we just wanted to make sure that the processes going forward are adequate and in place. So we'll be looking at the processes for that rather than individual data matches. The last year's were data matches for councillors and for officers.
Second question? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Well, 64 and 66 are around the council tax support matches and other ones, and they both show an increase, and it looks, just from a kind of scan through, it does look like there's been an increase. I don't know, kind of, if what impact that's having on your team in terms of resourcing. Is there a step change in the amount of fraud? Are you expecting a step change? Is it looking like there is at the moment? And how is that impacting on your ability to look at all the other stuff you've got to do?
In these particular cases, we weren't involved in doing the matches. They were done by the services, so that they were where they picked up issues that came through, and they would work through all the matches and see whether quite a lot of the matches we get through, as you can imagine, are timing differences, or if you look at the ones payroll to payroll, they're quite legitimate. We have got people who work for us, who work for Rotherham Council, or work for somewhere else, so that it's quite legitimate. We have such an interest in things like we get bank account duplicates, and you think, why are a lot of people having the same bank account on our payroll? You get oddities in that, in things like doctors who do post-mortems may all work for Sheffield teaching hospitals, and therefore the bank account, and we just work through it. So we're not finding massive frauds in there, but it's not taking a lot of resources. But these are good matches, and they've resulted in savings to the council.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Kevin.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 questions. I'll ask them individually. In terms of the rates of fraud that we see in Sheffield, how do they compare with other authorities of a similar size? So I suppose the question is, how confident are you that compared to an equal size authority that we are detecting the right level of fraud? And if you are confident, is that because of the systems that we've got in place, or because we're just particularly good at weeding them out?
It's an interesting question that. We have had significant frauds in the past, so I'm never complacent in it. To look at something like the COVID ones, we had less than other councils because we asked a few more questions up front. So we were quick in doing it, so the criminals weren't. So some of the ones were delayed in making payments. The criminals took them a couple of days to work out how to do it. But we asked a few more questions up front, and that prevented. One of the things we don't pick up particularly well is things like some of the bank mandate frauds, where the numbers that we actually reject. So if somebody sends us one through and we say, nice try, and reject it, that's not always linked as an issue. But we have a smaller team than a lot of the other authorities, but I don't think we have any difficulties in the number of frauds. We're not aware that we are lacking in any particular area as against any other councils. But cross my fingers, hopefully some of our controls are better. But that's not so tomorrow somebody might come along at the council and say, we found 37 frauds and this is where it is. We're only as good as the people that come to us or the systems that find it. But we do quite a bit of work to try and make sure that our controls are adequate and well managed. And that's one of the reasons we're going to pick up on the mandate fraud, not because we have had one incident a number of years ago which nearly lost us a lot of money, and as a result of that we're very aware of the controls we need in there.
Thank you. Second question, you mentioned it yourself, Stephen, was around COVID grants. There was, obviously, we had a short period of time, a lot of money to try and get out to help businesses, people and so forth. There was no specific mention of it in your report, but thinking from a national level, there was lots of reports of the level, you know, a high level of fraud according to that. As a result of handing out the COVID grants, you said yourself just then that actually, because of our more robust process in terms of making sure that they qualify for them in the first place, then you didn't see as much. But is that the answer to that question in terms of the robustness of before we actually handed those grants out, we weeded the majority of fraud cases out?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you some figures, because I spoke to a colleague and got the figures that were provided. We gave out well over £100 million worth of COVID grants. The total value of errors, this is not fraud, this is errors in the system, was about £680,000. And we've recovered well over £300,000 of that. And the rest of it, we are in the process of recovering it. These are government grants which were given to us on a set basis. So any losses are they're quite happy, and we report to them on a regular basis on what we're doing, so they're not making any recovery of those. But there are set processes we will follow to recover that money, and we are in the process of doing that. So if you think we've got about £300,000 outstanding as against £120 million worth of COVID grants, it's quite small, whereas some councils, in fact my colleague who worked for me for a number of years has just gone to the British Business Bank, and she's got the job of trying to recover the hundreds of millions of pounds which they've got. So £300,000 is a lot of money. We want it back, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not in terms of the processes that we use to get that money out quickly.
Thank you. And last question: which area causes you greatest concern?
The area that dropped on my desk this morning. So you can never be complacent in this. And one of the key things that me and Jane do when we sit on the policies board is to look at the policies that are coming through to make sure that we've got adequate arrangements in place, and that all processes deteriorate over time, and that's where our audit roles come in. I do the computer audits for the council, and also the resources audits. So we're always looking to make sure the controls are adequate in there as part of the normal day job.
Okay, thank you. Tom, then.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Stephen. I've got a number of perhaps specific questions, then one more general one. I'll probably ask them all together, if that's all right, save coming back and forth. So the first was around fraud e-learning. You mentioned that it's compulsory for managers. Has consideration been given about making it compulsory for all staff? So that would be my first question. The second was around the work that's going on at the moment to update the policy on whistleblowing. And I wondered whether or not you felt that the current policy was robust enough to protect whistleblowers, and if in the course of updating the new policy, whether or not there's consultation going on with the staff trade unions around that particular point, the protection of whistleblowers. The third more specific question was around COVID grants, actually, which is because there's been a higher degree of public attention and media attention around COVID grants, and I noticed that you said that this has been a separate process of data matching instigated by the Cabinet Office. Will they be releasing more information to the press or to the public about fraud that has been committed against Sheffield City Council from COVID grants? And then the more general one was actually going to be the question that Kevin's just asked, which is what most concerns you. So a variant of that is when you look at the fraud work across the piece, where do you think we could be stronger? Thanks.
I'll take this in the order you've given me. When we looked at the fraud e-learning, we did go back and suggest that it is compulsory for all officers. And I know Ryan has encouraged all finance staff to undertake it. It was decided to start off to get it to the managers first. So that's why it's compulsory for those. But they are reviewing the compulsory element of all officers' training. And it was something we'll push for, whether we get that. Or whether we look over time, we're having a new platform for some of our training, whether we do a more simplified version. It covers a lot in a short period of time, but whether there is something just to get the key messages out there. The whistleblowing policy, that one's Gillian's area, but I've been involved in quite a few of the whistleblowing investigations. We don't get a lot. That's one of the areas in some councils. I know of at least one of the major councils where a couple of years ago they got 3/4 of their entire staff on whistleblowing. We've never been that. We get them on a rolling basis, but we do our utmost to protect those individuals. And the unions know that where we have been involved, you know, we do go the extra mile to protect those, their identities, or the individuals if their identities become known. The COVID grants, they will, part of the NFI, they do produce a report which comes out nationally and will be reported in the press as to how much they've recovered. We tend to recover less than some of the London authorities. A simple one being things like blue badges. It gets you away from or it used to, from the emission charges in London. So the cost and the fraud involved in that is much higher than it would be in a city like Sheffield. And as for the areas where we could strengthen, I think all areas you could strengthen. It's always a balance between the cost of the controls in there and the likelihood of fraud. And we hope we've got that balance pretty much right at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for that report. It strikes me there's really two elements to this. There's one, internal fraud, employees, and protecting ourselves against that, which is where the whistleblowing and who to report to and making sure people feel comfortable about that. And then there's obviously the procedures to protect ourselves from external fraud, as it were, and equally, well, both very important. We've got three recommendations that we note the content of this report, that we note the Council's policies in relation to fraud and corruption have been reviewed and fulfil the required governance arrangements for the Council. And finally, that we note the completed checklist for those responsible for governance, noting the points that have been raised in relation to that as well. Are those three recommendations all agreed? Yes, I've got nods of assent from around the room. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Right, we now move on to item 8 on the agenda, which is role of Audit Committee and training. And is it Jane or Ryan that's doing this? Ryan, yeah.
Thanks, Chair. So this is a much shorter report setting out or bringing to the committee's attention a new SIPFA note on the role of audit committees in local government, which is really important for us to take proper account of. So, SIPFA have updated their guidance on the role of audit committees. It's attached as Appendix 1 to this report, and this position statement really sets out the key principles for what makes a good audit committee, around being clear about the purpose of it, how the committee is structured, the membership of it, its core functions, how it engages with the rest of the organisation, with people like myself, like Gillian, Chief Executive and so on, and recommends an approach for the committee to ensure it's properly trained and it reviews its role on a regular basis. So all good practice stuff here, and I'm quite happy that we are compliant with this statement. What Claire has set out in the report as some training that she's proposing the committee undertakes during the course of the next session. Some of it is more generic training, so where organisations like SIPFA put on webinars that we would recommend or suggest that the committee members attend or sign up for, and then specific training that we are planning in November ahead of the accounts coming for formal sign-off. So that will be bespoke training with an external trainer that we'll set up for the committee members, essentially to provide training on how to scrutinise a set of local government accounts, so that when you come to the final meeting with the auditors and council finance officers to finalise the accounts, that you've had some training on our accounts, using our accounts as the example on the sort of questions that an external trainer thinks you might want to be asking of us. I think members who've been on the committee before or for a while will have experienced that kind of training before. I know it's something that we used to do quite a long time ago. So the recommendation, Chair, is that the committee notes that and adopts the training programme as recommended in the report, and obviously happy to take any questions that members have. Thank you.
Kevin?
Just to note that on the first two half-day webinars, the second one, the 14th, is the same date as full council, so you may not get much uptake for that one. That was all. Thank you, Chair.
Go on, Grant.
That's actually a public training session organised by SIPFA, so a recording would be available afterwards for members to watch back. That's not we'd obviously work with members to pick a suitable date, particularly for the November session, that as many as possible could attend, because that's a bespoke session that we're running rather than a public session.
Tom, then Angela.
Thank you.
You're very chivalrous there.
Just on page 196, just a point of clarification on the first bullet point where it says there's a greater emphasis on audit committee being independent of other governance committee, including executive and scrutiny committee, to allow it focus objectively. So would the S&R be an executive committee? And if that is the case, does it mean that people who are on the S&R committee shouldn't be on audit and standards? Or is just... And also, the last paragraph of the bottom bullet point on that page, do we do a report as a committee, as members, about what we've done during the year and, you know, our relationship with exec? I can't really remember whether that happened before.
So this committee reports to full council and nowhere else. So I think that's a key part of independence. If the committee had many members of strategy and resources on it, that might be a concern. That's not the case. I think you're the only one. That's a separate issue, but agreed. So if it were heavily populated by committee chairs, members of Strategy and Resources Committee, that might be a concern. That's not the case. So I think it meets the requirements from my perspective for independence. So I'm happy that we comply with that point there. A very good question on the last paragraph. I think that's perhaps one, Chair, that we can talk about outside as to whether a report by this committee on its activities and whether the committee members are satisfied is something that we can look to do.
Yeah, certainly. I think we need to do that. I just note that some of us are new to the committee as well, and then on page 197, there's the top one is badged as essential, and the bottom one is badged as essential. And I think that sort of report need to capture the fact that we've fulfilled those requirements at some point. And as Kevin's pointed out, we'll probably have to do the second session via recording, but we can deal with that in September. Gillian then. Gillian.
Thank you. Once again, this is sit for assuming we've got an executive and a non-executive, which we haven't. Just to be clear, Strategy and Resources isn't an executive committee, but there's just the way these things are written, just assume that there is. But Ryan's analysis of the situation is spot on. You wouldn't want the chair of this committee to be the chair of any other of the decision-making committees. You can't have complete separation because every single councillor within the council is a decision-maker now because we run a committee system. So you just need to make sure that you've got a reasonable balance within it, but you are effectively given two hats to do it. With regard to the annual report, I think because the delegation has come directly from full council to this committee, there's never been a requirement to report up to full council. You've got full delegation to deal with everything, but I think it's a good practice if that's something you want to introduce.
Okay, thank you. Tom.
Thanks. Two minor points, really. The first is, could anyone say why this committee only has 7 members rather than 9, which is something I've, I guess, just been puzzling about. And it doesn't say in the guide about sort of how many members a committee should have. I just wondered, given that we went through a review of all of our processes over the last year before I joined, whether there was discussion around that. And then the second point, just to note really, is something that I flagged last meeting, which is the timing of training. And maybe it's a piece of feedback to pass to SIPFA, which is a session on the introduction to the audit committee in September. 4 months on from when most people will have joined an audit committee doesn't necessarily seem to be particularly smart, given that most of us who are new members will have gone through 2 meetings in our case, and quite a lot of background work as well. So yeah, perhaps it's just something to pass to SIPFA. Thanks.
I'm certainly happy to provide the feedback to SIPFA. I don't know if Gillian can help me out on.
Yeah. So the governance committee looked at all of the committees when they were assessing what changes were required. Because there were so many significant changes required to the decision making and the policy committees, they kind of took a principle that if it wasn't broke, let's not try and fix it. So it's just kept the same format. The Audit and Standards Committee has kept the same format as it had in the old system, which is absolutely fine because it's a committee of full council anyhow, so it wasn't affected by the shift to the committee system. So the Governance Committee are doing a review after 6 months, starting from November. So if there's any feeling that there ought to be some different, a different measure for the size of the committee, then you can feed that into that. Thank you.
Simon.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if perhaps I could just comment on the size of the committee. I mean, in those terms, I think this is about the right size. I think it might be possible to have more independent members and perhaps fewer members. But the issue is once you get beyond 10 or 11 members, it's easy for a member to hide. And in audit committee, we don't want members to hide. We want members to be out there cross-examining people and getting in. So I think once you get beyond about the size we've got, it becomes a little bit unwieldy when you're doing that. Sorry, yeah. So that was what was I thinking about this? Yeah. So I was just going to also kind of contrast the training that I've received as a member of the Pensions Authority, and that is very much compulsory. Very much hand up your back. Why haven't you done it? If you haven't, you have to go into Barnsley and sit there, and they will take you through it on a laptop. So I mean, I think, you know, for them, it's perhaps, it feels more of a reputational thing to make sure that all their members are trained, because it is very complicated. Yeah, I think, you know, obviously we need to make sure that all our members do turn up to all training, and as much as they can, and we make it as easy as we can, so that we don't have to frog-march them into training. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, whilst they're not here today, we do have independent members, which increases the size of this committee as well. Okay, no further questions on that. Therefore, the recommendation is to note and adopt the position statement and agree forward training programme to support members of the committee. Can I also add that we did have a virtual meeting with the external auditors that was very good a couple of weeks ago, and we undertook as well, and I'm not sure whether it's training, but it's probably worth noting in the minutes here that we've undertaken to have a further meeting with external auditors in the autumn time. Okay, that recommendation with that note for the minutes is agreed. Thank you. And that brings us finally to the work programme, which is there at page 205 on the agenda. And it's just to note this, and if anybody spotted anything that's slipped or wants to be included. I see no takers. Oh, yes, I see one taker. Gillian.
Thank you, Chair. On page 210, you've got, in November 22, a workshop to review the Members' Code of Conduct. That was copied over from the last workshop that you had, that we dealt with on Code of Conduct. What I would like to propose is that there was a training session that I'd agreed as part of the introduction of the new committee system that hasn't been delivered. And it is learning lessons from recent reports. And I thought it might be really good and relevant to the audit committee, and it picks up code of conduct matters in there as well. It's an external trainer, Beth Evans, if you've come across her. She has delivered some training sessions for us previously. And she is able to deliver that training for you just prior to the next meeting on the 22nd of September. But I wasn't sure whether you would be able to come an hour earlier for any training. But that's my suggestion, Chair.
Thank you. Yeah, we had discussed this before, and talking about it, quite a number of us are sort of familiar with the code of conduct, and we're a bit dry, and this seemed much more relevant and more interesting bit of training. We'll take feelings there. I had Tom, you've indicated as well you wanted to say something.
It was on a different point, so if anyone wanted to come on that.
Okay, yeah, fine. Yeah, so basically we were suggesting that we scrub the review of Members' Code of Conduct and replace it with the training in September. Simon?
Yeah, anyone who's been on the committee for more than a couple of years will be heartily sick of the Code of Conduct, I think. So, yes, please.
I see nods of agreement to that one. I need to check diary because quite often this not clashes, but I have a meeting of the scrutiny, and I don't think it's in September of the mayoral combined authority, but I think I'm all right in September. We can check diaries outside the meeting. Tom.
Thanks. Just looking at the meeting scheduled for 17th of November, we've got on the work programme the statement of accounts, the audited statement of accounts. And based on what Ryan said earlier on, I'm just wondering whether it makes sense to actually just move that now into the December meeting, and there's already a few things on the December meeting. So whether or not any of them could be swapped over, pulled forward, given that we've got sufficient, sort of 4 months notice. Welcome kind of Ryan's assessment on that, I suppose. Thanks.
The other point is it'd be quite good to have it within the legal time frame, as it were, still on our work programme, because you never know, we might make the end of the month. Ryan, what do you think?
You took the words right out of my mouth, Chair. That I think we need a meeting in the sort of hope and expectation that we do actually hit the statutory deadline, and then, but recognising there's a reasonable probability that we won't.
Yeah, I understand that. Thanks.
It gives them a name, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, no other comments on that. And next meeting with the 22nd of September, and possibly, would that cause any problems having that training an hour beforehand, 4 till 5, or not? We're just consulting diaries at the moment. Pardon? It's okay. That seems like a 3:45 now. Yeah. Okay, that seems, as we're here and it's done, and then you say it's coming in twice or whatever. Okay, thank you very much for that, and that closes the meeting.